So this week we're going to take a little quick look at the theology and the Christology of Gregory of Nyssa. Now, Gregory really is known as one of the great patristic fathers of the church, one of the Cappadocian fathers. He came from a very established Christian family. One of his brothers and his sister were seen as being his tutor and mentor and schooled him really in some brilliant theology. But he really stands in his own right as one of the great early Christian thinkers and brings a gospel that I would say is really characterized by hope. And it's a beautiful and sometimes quite complex offering that he gives us. So Gregory of Nyssa wrote his great catechism while he was the Bishop of Nyssa in the 300s and was instrumental in some of the great councils and creeds of the early days of the church. Now, what I would say about him is that he is definitely not a Calvinist. You could put it that way for all kinds of reasons, but one of the main reasons would be just his worldview, his vision of creation and humankind. Whereas Calvin would present to us a theology that would say that the substance of humankind is fully corrupt, total depravation. That's really how his theology is titled at that part, total depravation of humankind. Gregory comes at things from a completely different, actually the opposite angle. He would say, you know, if God is the God of infinite and boundless goodness, then creation itself is an expression of that goodness, and humankind is the pinnacle of the expression of God's creative goodness. And so when we look at the world and when we look at each other, that which we are meant to see is the goodness of God. However, that isn't really normally what we see. Why? Because we have wandered from the light, we have wandered into darkness and death and sin and evil and have lost ourselves in these things. But then comes Jesus. So the incarnation of Jesus is, according to Gregory of Nyssa, not an absurd event that sort of stretches credibility, but rather it is, you could almost say, the most natural extension of God's love. The fullest expression of God's magnanimous goodness is the very fact that he becomes now one of us, that Jesus is the embodiment of God's goodness, and he comes to remind us of the goodness of God, and he also comes to remind us of who we are and what we are created to be. We are created to be the people who experience God's beauty and express God's goodness and beauty one to the other, but we have lost our way in that. And so his Christology really centers around this hope and this beautifully uplifting message that we're not really seen by God as stains and problems to be solved, but rather we are seen by God as something beautiful and magnificent, but we have lost our way. And Jesus comes as the light of the world into our darkness, and he's the blinding light at the center, and he calls us back to himself. And that journey is the gospel. That journey is the returning to our first love, to apprehend the beauty of God. That becomes the center of the gospel, that we are then brought into God's life to suddenly awaken to the goodness and the beauty that was always ours to begin with. So it really is, it's not a Calvinistic approach at all. It's something actually much older and much deeper, and I think perhaps there can be much more wisdom in it as well. It certainly it brings great light to our lives when we start to understand that God's disposition towards us, his posture towards us, is one of extreme and profound benevolence and self-giving, and wants to draw us back into himself. So that's a little snapshot of Gregory of Nyssa. There's a lot more to his theology. He's really complex when he starts to talk about the metaphysics of evil and goodness, and it's hard reading, but it's brilliant stuff. So there's a little glimpse, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of good and hopeful food for thought for these days. Till next time, peace.